introduce you to Kris Koestner, who is going to talk to you about Jacob Hatzenbeeler.
Come on down, folks. Have I got a deal for you on the east side meat market right here on the Centerville Square? By God Almighty, I tell you what, when Lisa asked me to do this, I said I'd be happy to because I love history. But I tell you what, how many of you believe in reincarnation? My God Almighty, when I started looking up this gentleman here, I said, my God, that's me all over again. Well, Joseph Hatzenbeeler was born in Rebisch, Bavaria, Germany in 1832. At the age of 22, in 1954, 6 years before the American Civil War, he arrived in New York City. Being competitive and driven, he soon moved on to Detroit, Michigan. Spent a short time there. Then he moved on south to Galesburg, Illinois. He jumped across the river to Burlington and then moved on to Wapello, Iowa. And then in 1860, at the age of 28, he arrived in Centerville, Iowa. Now, I tell you what, Jacob was a very driven man. He must have made a few bucks along the way because he quickly bought 20 acres of land, and as they say, location, location, location is important, adjacent to the Centerville, on the Centerville Square, and 20 acres right behind it. He was kind of a driven individual. He soon had 2 commercial buildings and 5 homes in Centerville, Iowa. Jacob arrived single, but in a short 2 years, he married a hometown girl named Lydia Strickland. She came from a prominent family, and I believe her family had the Strickland store, dry goods store on the northwest corner of the Centerville Square, which I own today, the Koestner building with the rounded glass windows. Jacob was Catholic. He was Lutheran. Nope. He was Republican. And his wife was a staunch Methodist. So that made an interesting combination right there. With this union, they had 4 children, 2 of them dying at an early age. Now his son Martin and his daughter Barbara soon joined his father in the family store. Now Jacob died at an early age in 1880 at the age of 46. But in that short time he became a unique entrepreneur, as I said, owning a couple of buildings and 5 houses. He wheeled and dealed in several commodities. And the local newspaper called the Centerville Journal in 1872, he announced proudly he had purchased 20,000 pounds of celebrated Enterprise mill flour from Macon, Missouri. Like the man today, he said this flour would not be undersold by anybody, but it was going to be paid in full before it left the store. Jacob, being driven and hard-headed German, was going to make sure nobody beat him in prices. Surprise, surprise. Cornmeal sold for this, are you ready, in 1872. Now, it can't get much cheaper than this, 1 cent a pound. Coffee was 42 cents a pound because it's still an import. Sugar, by today's standards, still a deal, 10 cents a pound, 10-pound bag, $1 bill. Now listen to this, beef roast in 1872 were 19 cents a pound. Pretty reasonable deal. Smoked meats, bacon, and hams were 13 cents a pound. Potatoes, he sold a bushel, which is 54 pounds, had to look that one up. But today you can buy for a $1 bill. Today you can buy a 50-pound bale for less than 10 bucks at the Lowe's store. Sausage sold for 12 cents a pound, which is a pretty good deal. Now he's blowing about this flour. Flour would cost $4.75 a barrel. A barrel of flour weighed 196 pounds, so it was less than 3 cents a pound. $1 in 1872 would be equivalent to about a $12 bill today. Another ad in the same paper assured his suppliers of fresh meats. Now there wasn't any John Morell's a few years away yet. He got his fresh meats from the local farmers. He would pay the highest price for fat stock of all kinds. Obviously, they didn't know about cholesterol back in those days in the 1870s, and that's probably why he died at the age of 46. But Jacob knew he had to have fat cattle in order to have his meats to be tender and juicy. He also mentioned in his ads, when he bought the meat, that he paid premium prices for the fat cattle and hindquarters. Hindquarters being where you get your round steaks and your T-bones and sirloins. He also would pay a premium price for boneless meats. Being in Germany, he's pretty smart to buy that boneless meat, but it had to have no gristle in it. His meats and fish at that time were warranted to be fresh and tender, just like the bargain man of today. He also mentioned he had ice on hand at all times. This is long before refrigerators were present in Centerville, Iowa. And Jacob's business was not just limited in selling fresh meats. One of the sidelines was buying hides and pelts to resell to the tanneries. That's probably one of the reasons why they have state inspectors today to check out the stores. Can you imagine a smelly pile of hides sitting next to your bar, a barrel of flour back in the back room? Now Jacob, as I said, was a German, and like what a Germans, he did what he did best, and the best thing he did apparently was make beer. That also caught the attention of the U.S. revenue agents. In one of the ads in the Journal, he offered to pay 20 cents a bushel for up to 1,000 bushels of corn. Now today that bushel of corn is about $8. But in a later ad shortly after that, or later news story shortly after that, it said the United States revenue agents were in Centerville to investigate a distillery in the back of Jacob's store. He was told either to cease making his beer or he would be prosecuted. Well, Jacob was a community leader in sort. He furnished the benches out in front of his store, I think for the sole purpose is to let the gentlemen hang around to discuss and cuss the city fathers. Jacob's trials and tribulations were just beginning for this hard-headed German with the city. Jacob also had a large bell above his store. The first purpose I believe he used it for was to announce, got fresh fish on sale at the East Side Market, folks. But it was also used to notify people in the community of a fire. And they had a big one up there on the Centerville Square, I think in 1861, July 4th, when they set the fireworks off in the cupola up there. That didn't work out so well for him. Jacob also had a pond on his 20 acres adjacent to the Centerville Square. Now, I can't quite figure out where they would have had a pond, but I do know he owned some properties right around there on East State Street. He also said for 25 cents, you could fish the pond, and he would guarantee you a fish every time. In the late 1890s, the city fathers of Centerville were trying to improve the image of our community. Well, one of the reasons was that Centerville is a robust mining community, and there's a lot of wooden signs and wooden awnings around the Centerville Square. So in the 1890s, the city council passed an ordinance that you could not have those signs hanging less than 7 feet and the wooden awnings had to go. The purpose was to make the Centerville Square a more attractive place for business and shoppers. Now, I'm going to tell you what, that ordinance in 1890 is still in effect, because in the early 1970s it was referred to when we put our awning out in front of J&K. It is still on the books. Canvas awnings were becoming the rage back at the turn of the century. Jacob's store was one of the last ones to remove that wooden awning and swinging signs. Now I'm going to tell you what, he did so in protest because he was faced with $1 a day or up to $10 a day for infringement of breaking the rules on that ordinance. In 1917, Jacob's wife, Lydia, died in her home at 418 East State. The Langford Funeral Home took care of her services. She was 75 years old. That's just right off the square there. In 1918, in the height of World War I, Jacob's store, a one-story building, was condemned by the Iowa State Fire Marshals, probably at the urging of the city of Centerville because of a fire trap. It was one of the last remaining wooden buildings on the square. He was given 60 days to remove that building. Most of the present-day buildings on Central Square had been built of masonry and brick by this time. The courthouse and square were paved in 1904. In 1919, the family sold his remaining 100 by 100-foot property behind his business on the square, which would be right across from the Armory on East Jackson, where there's a rental property now. And his wife, Jacob and Lydia, have laid in peace here for just about 100 years. We thank you for coming.